Buenas tardes. Clausuramos el Foro Social con la última charla, el desafío africano ante la globalización económica. Sin más dilación, cedo la palabra a Nicolás Castellano, periodista de la cadena SER.
Bueno, buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias. Gracias por estar aquí con este sol de justicia que anima a un baño en la playa. Gracias a la organización por haberme invitado a moderar esta mesa y a compartir, sobre todo, esta charla con dos personas tan interesantes, con Samir y con David, que nos van a ofrecer una visión distinta pero complementaria sobre la visión de la economía, ¿no? La economía globalizada, la economía capitalista. Si los... Cuando a mí me plantearon la moderación de esta mesa, y leyendo y conociendo la obra de Samir, me preguntaba, ¿es que solo se puede medir el crecimiento de un país con la visión capitalista, con la macroeconomía, con los números que marcan el Producto Interior Bruto, con los índices de desempleo, con los índices de fluctuación, de crecimiento en la bolsa, el número de grandes empresas que puede tener un país o de industria? Bueno, esa era la pregunta que me hacía y es un poco las que vamos a plantear esta tarde, ¿no? Como saben, el continente africano la situación de Ghana, la situación de Egipto, Marruecos, que no tienen nada que ver con lo que se vive hoy en Sudán del Sur, un país que tiene una hambruna ahora mismo, Nigeria, que es el país más poblado y económicamente más importante del continente, pero que sin embargo tiene a 7 millones de personas muriéndose de hambre en el noreste por el conflicto de Boko Haram, o con lo que pasa en Somalia, que está a punto de enfrentarse a la que sería su tercera hambruna. Así que, como punto de partida, cuando vamos a hablar de economía, del crecimiento, de la situación a la que se enfrentan muchas personas en el continente, es bueno partir de la base de la diversidad, ¿no? Hay muchas realidades diferentes dentro del continente africano. Igual que cuando hablan de Europa, no es lo mismo lo que pasa en España con lo que pasa en Dinamarca o con lo que pasa en Suiza. Es interesante y es importante cuando hablemos de África no hablar de un todo, sino una realidad muy diferente. Bueno, para hablar de estas temáticas, de en qué medida la economía capitalista o el crecimiento convencional económico están aportando algo o no al avance de los africanos, les voy a presentar primero a Samir Amin. Si siguen un poco la bibliografía de los pensadores de izquierda sobre la evolución de la economía, etcétera, etcétera, es una de las voces más autorizadas. Para mí, la verdad que es un placer estar hoy aquí con él. Él es de Egipto, nació en el Cairo, es economista, estudió en París, y es uno de los pensadores considerados por todos más interesantes de la izquierda contemporánea, ¿no? Ha sido consejero del gobierno de Mali en los años 60, es un gran trabajador, ahora mismo vive en Dakar, dirigiendo una de las instituciones, dirige el Instituto de Pensamiento Radical del Cairo, una de las pocas instituciones que siguen existiendo, y sobre todo ha sido conocido por haber fundado organizaciones como el Foro Social del Tercer Mundo y el Foro Mundial de las Alternativas. Samir tiene un currículum que podría estar toda la tarde leyéndolo, pero como presentación yo creo que es suficiente. Y a mi derecha está Davide Cirillo, que tiene un doctorado en Geografía Humana y en Física de la Universidad de Padua y Antropología Social y Cultural en una universidad de Ámsterdam. Él trabaja sobre todo con el tema de la geografía rural. Habrán escuchado hablar del acaparamiento de tierra, ¿verdad? De las consecuencias que genera esto en muchas partes del mundo, pero que está generando especialmente en el continente africano, ¿no? Yo recuerdo situaciones bastante complicadas desde hace mucho tiempo en Madagascar, en Tanzania, en Kenia, incluso en Etiopía, con un gobierno tan férreo. Ahora mismo hay grandes corporaciones alemanas y holandesas que cultivan en grandes fincas de Etiopía, ¿no? Y nos va a hablar del tema del acaparamiento de tierras, pero igual que vamos a empezar desde lo global y desde la visión económica de la situación, a lo particular. Vamos a aterrizar en un caso muy concreto del delta del río Senegal, donde vamos a hablar de cómo están afectando a las comunidades. Así que hecha esta breve introducción para que nos situáramos sobre la mesa, le voy a dar la palabra a Samir para que nos sitúe en su cuadratura de pensamiento sobre todo esto que está pasando. Samir, cuando quiera. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, compañero, moderador. Buenas tardes a todas y todos y muchas gracias por ser aquí. Me voy a hablar en inglés porque en castellano sería una catástrofe. I think that first I want to thank the organizers of Rototom. It's, I think, a beautiful event, a beautiful festival with the fiesta dimension, but also with serious discussions on important questions and issues. Thanks to all of you. Now, it is a good thing that we come at the end of this festival and after the presentation of Firoz Manji yesterday, because Firoz has made an excellent introduction, I think, to what we are going to continue discussing. He analyzed the reality of social movements throughout the world, and in particular in Africa, and classified them into two types. Those who are resulting from a protest against the system, resistance and protest, in some cases even revolt, and those who, beyond that, are able or capable to start changing the power system. And this is central. I am going to speak around this central question, how to change the power system in favor of the popular classes around the whole world, North and South, and in particularly for the South in Africa. And I am very happy that I'm sharing with an Italian comrade who will translate that in one specific and important and decisive sector, agriculture, in a concrete way. Because you may think, after having heard me, that my discourse is too general, too abstract, and far from being, could be translated into political real action. No, it can be, it must be, and I think that that should come out of our presentations. Now, I'm going to try to, I have to make a selection, a severe selection, because having only half an hour, it's not long time. We cannot speak of everything, including which is relevant. We have to be selective. I will try to arrange my comments along three questions. One, what are the characteristics of the present capitalist imperialist system today? In order to avoid generalities about capitalism and to go too far into the history of the various stages of its development and global deployment, to focus on what is relevant for us in order to understand what challenges the people are meeting today in that system. That is a first series of questions. Second, since we'll conclude quickly that this system is really bad, is really totally negative with respect to the interest of all the people, North and South, then what are the major characteristics of a possible alternative, and I would put alternatives in plural, a family of alternatives. To that, I would say, dare to say, declining and non-sustainable, horrible system. which is declining. But the fact that it is declining and not sustainable doesn't mean that what follows or what will follow will simply be better by itself. No, it can follow into decline, into a chaos and wars. And that is the case today. And third series of questions, how to move towards that alternative, at least what are the first stages in the move to, and what are the not only economic conditions, but political and organizational conditions for the struggle. Now, first series of questions. I personally qualify the present stage of capitalist imperialist system by having reached a level of centralization of the power system, and power system in all its dimensions, that is not only economic power system, but political power system, military power system, cultural or pseudo-cultural and ideological power system, to a level which we never had before in the history, in the long history of capitalism. Now, we have reached that level. Now, to go fast, I will remind the people who perhaps know some of my writings that the global capitalism is global since the first day, 1492, which all Spanish people know what it means. Not the discovery of America, but the conquer of America, the conquest of America. Now, this system has been, throughout ages, 4 centuries, 5 centuries, imperialist. Imperialism, I disagree with Lenin, is not the latest stage, it's the permanent stage of capitalism. Now, why? Because the social integration that capitalism produces has 3 dimensions. It's creating an integrated market of commodities and of capital, an integrated market of finance and capital, and an integrated market for labor force. But, and that is the case with each of, grosso modo, each country or small region in the global capitalist world. But if we look at the capitalist system as a global system, it is integrating markets in 2 dimensions only: commodities, trade, and capital, but not labor force, which remains limited in its movements by a political factor and by the existence of boundaries. And therefore, by this itself, it is generating necessarily 2 patterns of accumulation of capital and of globalization in the globalization process. The center, what I have called since 60 years now, since exactly 1954, centers and peripheries of the same global capitalist system. Of course, this has moved through stages and ages, and certainly at each time there are many things important new, and I'm focusing on what is important today. At this new stage, as I said, what is characteristic is the centralization of power, not the centralization of the property of capital, of power at economic level, in the sense that most of the economic productive activities throughout the world, north and south, are now reduced to the status of subcontracting for a handful, some thousands of so-called multinationals, I mean big companies, and some tens, not more, of major financial institutions, banks, in order, and that leads to an increasing part of the surplus produced by labor is transformed into a monopoly rent, not super profits, of an oligarchy. The global system and the capitalist system today is an oligarchic system. Oligarchy is not Russian. It's more, you find it not less in the United States, in Japan, in France, in Germany, in Britain, and even in Spain than anywhere else. Now, a centralization of political power which goes along with that, which means that we have reached a point where the pattern of functioning of the democracy, the bourgeois democracy, particularly of the 19th and the 20th century, is disappearing. We are moving, we are de facto in a system, a one-party system, the party of the oligarchy, alone. Elections have lost completely their meaning, and this is dangerous. They have lost their credibility, and democracy is losing its legitimacy. That pattern of democracy, electoral representative democracy, without an alternative being advancing in its place. And this one-party system is in fact totalitarian. Totalitarianism is not the history of the Soviet Union, it's the history of present capitalism. No less much more totalitarian, in the sense that there are at their disposal what I'm calling a media clergy in the service of the financial aristocracy or oligarchy, just as in the old time you had a religious clergy at the service of the aristocracies, and which has the monopoly of fabricating an ideology whose function is basically to depoliticize the people, make them unable to understand where they live, what are the problems, unable to understand the working of the system, and therefore unable to develop alternative political strategies. Now, this is the system. At the present stage, at least in Europe, this totalitarian system seems to be smooth, I mean soft. But let's be careful. If the struggle develop and take a higher level of lucidity, it will become very violent, more and more. And this is why this totalitarian system is based on the militarization of the political control. NATO is central, and the so-called security helped by their allies, the terrorists, who are their allies, very useful for them, put the militarization of the system in the front and allows for moving towards something lack of vocabulary we could call fascism or neo-fascism or soft fascism, as you want, but much more violent than it is presently. Now, another characteristic of this system, which is the consequence of that centralization of power, is that we have reached a stage where imperialism is now the collective imperialism of the historical imperialist countries, the major one, that is US, Western and Central Europe, Britain, Germany, France, and some others, and Japan, which I call for that purpose the triad. Now, the point here is that they are their ruling class, their oligarchies, which are economic and political oligarchies, are aware that they cannot manage the globalization, the world, because the rest of the world is only a minority of 85% of humankind when you add Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They cannot manage it but by a solidarity, military and political solidarity amongst them. That is a very important point to understand the present type of challenges. Now, what are in that frame the acting powers, the ruling powers, the acting among them? Of course, the oligarchies of the triad, I've said, but oligarchies also of the comprador pattern of power in most of the countries, almost all at the present time, of the Big South and the former East, that is the former Soviet Union and Eastern European. I consider them semi-colonies of Western Europe and Central Europe. They are in a relation similar to the relation of Latin America to the United States. Now, some of them develop already, and I'm speaking here of the ruling class, the ruling political class, which is something a little different from the ruling or the most important at the economic level, economic dominant class, are developing a possibility of operating within that globalization and capitalism, but without accepting necessarily its rules. And that is trying to change the rule of globalization by participating to it. That is in the policy basically of China, but also coming more and more clear of Russia and potentially of other countries. Potentially, they are not of other countries presently. But there are indications in that sense for big and less big countries, not necessarily only continental countries. And I think it's an illusion that the project of becoming a capitalist, national, autonomous in the frame of globalization is not viable. But anyway, I have no time to go into that. I have written on that, particularly with respect to China and to Russia. Now, that system is not viable. Is not viable, not only because it leads to a permanent relative stagnation of the economy of the triad, US, Europe, and Japan, rates of growth very low, less than 2%, as compared to 5% after World War II for 30 years, which is not compensated by the higher growth that we see in many places in the South, in China in particular, but also in comprador areas, including in Africa. Now, it is, I come to the second point, which is, what is the alternative, or the family of alternatives? But I put it singular to be short. It's delinking, that is moving out as far as you can, and it's a practical and relative concept. It's not you leave the Earth and you go into the moon, no. Today as yesterday, and that has a history. To take only the very recent history, the national liberation movements in Asia and Africa were movements which target was not only political recovering, political independence and recognition as sovereign states, but associating it with internal social change, progressive. I'm not saying socialist. Socialist or so-called socialist in the countries which have gone through a socialist revolution, a revolution in the name of socialism, Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and less than that in the other regions, even if they call themselves socialists. Now, that reality of a relative delinking, there was globalization, but it was a globalization, a polycentric, negotiated or semi-negotiated globalization. I do not accept at all this blah blah dominating today, that the period was the period of bipolarity and military competition between the two giants, US and Soviet Union. That is false. It was a polycentric system in which you had at least 4 partners. The imperialist center, the triad, Soviet Union with its, we may call them semi-colonies also, dependent countries of Eastern Europe, China, which was always, and from very early, relatively independent from Soviet Union, and as a result of Bandung and the non-aligned, the countries, the states of all or almost all Asia and Africa, except the Gulf republics, the Democratic Republic of Saudi Arabia and the Democratic Republic of Qatar has been always pro-West. Now, that was a pattern, a polycentric pattern. And it means that the internal system of power and the class struggle within those societies cannot be isolated from the achievements at the level of globalization. Now, today, we meet the same challenge. That is, we need also a delinking from that system, but of course in conditions which are not exactly the same as they were in the past. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what is different because I've said it before, and the connection with the challenge today could be more visible if we had time to explain it, but I go fast. Delinking today for all countries, and I would say all countries, including in the north, including in Europe, including of the semi-periphery of Europe, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, but including in the south and in the former east, has to be associated with a project which I'm calling a national, sovereign, popular, potentially democratic project based on walking on 2 legs. One is industrialization. I'm not speaking of neither development nor modernization, but industrialization, which means building an integrated system of industrial production, integrated, and that strategy, that vision of industrialization is in total conflict with the concept of industrial, potentially industrial development in the countries of the South. Because the capitalist imperialist concept of industrialization is based on a variety of industrial establishments, each of them operating as a subcontractor de jure or de facto to monopoly capital of the Western triad oligarchy. that is dismantling the economic industrial system. And that is what was the first chapter in the history of Russia after the dismantling of Soviet Union. This is the history of the dismantling of what had been achieved previously in Eastern Europe. That is therefore building and integrated. It comes into conflict, and we should know it. There is one country, and one only to my knowledge, which has a vision of that industrialization. Is China. It's not industries export-oriented and semi-controlled by monopoly capital of the West. No, no, no. Along with that, this is part. But along with that, there is the reinforcing of the industrial system. And this is reviving in Russia and developing quite fast, particularly thanks to the sanctions against Russia. Now, therefore, what we ought to know, this is one leg in conflict. The other leg is the agrarian question. Presently, still 40% or more of human population live in rural areas. More than 3 billion out of a little more than 7 billion today. Now, the capitalist way of development for them is by concentrating the property of land and the access to land to a very small minority. Agrobusiness, in some places, big landlords associated with agrobusiness. In other places, a minority, which is no more than 5 or 10% of the present peasantry, rich peasant associated to them. That means that half of humankind are useless people already today. Useless. The best solution would be a general genocide. Another way is, what is their future? Shanty towns and the pressure for migration. The pressure for migration is the result of the logic of that capitalism system. Nothing else. And it will continue to increase, whether bearable or unbearable for the countries of the North. Now, therefore, the only alternative should be thought in the frame of a revival of peasant agriculture. I'm saying a revival, not maintaining a zoo for tourists of so-called traditional countryside. And that needs a lot of inventivity in the way of renovating that peasant agriculture with an access to land as equal as possible to most, if not all, of the present peasantry of Asia, Africa, Caribbean, and some parts in Latin America. It's very unequal, but I don't go into such details now. Now, that, my friend, will translate that into a very concrete example out of Rosbetio region in northern Senegal. And it could be translated, this we have discussed at length, particularly in China, for months and months, with thousands of activists and agronomists and others in Vietnam and in some places in Latin America, particularly Ecuador and Bolivia. Now, that articulating, connecting that one leg with the other needs planning, which means that the power should have a social content in relation with who is benefiting from that, which is the majority of the people and not a minority constituted in majority of what are called the new middle classes, which are associated with the reactionary pattern of globalization. It means that I have no, and there is no blueprint, the same pattern, and certainly not the Soviet model or even the Maoist model, but all models throughout history have, we can derive some lessons, but that's another point. We have to be clear. That system is contradictory. It is not the end of history, in the sense that it is there are internal conflict between some logics of capitalism. It's not a capitalist development, but it integrates capitalist logic partly in it, and the social interest of the majorities. It is also in conflict with the global system, and therefore cannot find its place but in and through a series of historical compromise, through forced negotiation and struggle at the international level. And now I come to the third, if you allow me to 5 minutes more, how to move towards that. Now, here we have to conciliate, which is not easy, national sovereignty with the internal move of power towards the majorities, that is, the working and popular classes. You could think that this is reformist. It is revolutionary advances which have a reformist form. Now, we ought to be clear about that, because the concept of national sovereignty is sadly understood, particularly in the North and particularly in Europe. And because national sovereignty has been throughout history the tool of the ruling class, which is the bourgeoisie, in order to control its internal proletariat, integrated partly through social democracy, and try to move up in the global hierarchy through competition and conflict, including wars. Now, and therefore we can understand that this type, let's call it, of bourgeois national sovereignty is rejected with good reasons by the people. But that's not the only understanding of national sovereignty. National sovereignty is also the tool of the oppressed class in order to move ahead towards their liberation. Now, in the South, everybody understands that, because after all, national liberation was a struggle for national independence, but precisely associated with, to various degrees, social change, progressive social change. In the North, it's not understood, because the North is imperialist. It's not, and therefore, two concepts. Now, we have to understand that. National sovereignty, therefore, is ambiguous, and we should call it, in that case, and this is the title of one of my major recent paper, national popular as against bourgeois democracy. Popular sovereignty as against bourgeois sovereignty. Now, in order to move towards that, and those national popular sovereignty pattern of power, and I'm not calling them fast socialists, are the conditions for being able to move towards achieving the two goals of industrialization and agrarian solution, progressive solution to the agrarian question. Now, that national popular sovereignty is not in conflict with internationalism. On the opposite, it is complementary, and it can work, it will work better as far as internationalism deepens and gets stronger also. The major problem for Soviet Union was that it was isolated. The responsibility of the people of the West for not having supported but fought the Russian Revolution and the Soviet system is the major reason for its growing problems, out of which it declined and broke down. And that might be repeated and repeated. And it was the same at various degrees with respect to the national popular experiences out of the national liberation in Asia and in Africa. We had out of 50 countries in Africa, some 20 or more, which made attempts, not only Mali, Guinea, Ghana, the first ones, but Benin, but Congo, Brazzaville, but Madagascar, but Tanzania, but Zambia to a certain extent. I mean, it's Ethiopia. Important countries and less important in size, but many countries, which means that the lack of internationalism, and particularly the imperialist spirit dominating in Europe, is highly responsible of the very limited capacity of those experiences to go ahead. And therefore we need internationalism. And internationalism is internationalism. It is bringing together all the victims of that imperialist capitalist system, which are not only the vast majorities of the people of the South, but a good majority also of the peoples of the North. Now, how to bring them together? This, and I could end more or less with that, implies reconstructing an international that is an organization, not controlling the movements and the struggles, but bringing together the struggles in order that they complement one another, they support one another, and they go through a strategy which can change the balance of powers in many places in the South and in the North, unequally as usual in history, but gradually. Now, the precondition to that is therefore accepting the idea that we need to move from vague fraternity, while the Europeans can love the Africans. Okay, that's better than hate them, of course, much better. But that's not enough. That's not enough. They have to conduct together struggles, together. And there are no struggles without an organization. And the organization creates, whether we like it or not, leaderships, with all the dangers of that. But that has been constant in history. Now we ought, and this will be my conclusion, I suggest to start those common struggles, bringing together people of the North and of the South, in some areas which are less controversial and could be less difficult to understand for on both sides, North and South. I think that a campaign of action, not of blah blah, on restoring the main social services, popular social service, education, health, transport, housing, the victims of them are 70%, 60% of the north, people in the north, and 90% people of the south. And therefore, that could be a ground for starting a common action to change the balance of power. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Samir. Muy interesante todas las cuestiones que pone sobre la mesa. Algunas de ellas relacionadas con el modelo de desarrollo. Él ha hablado del problema de la emigración hacia las ciudades, la creación de grandes ciudades, el abandono del ámbito rural. Hay grandes ciudades del planeta, de las más habitadas, que están en África. El Cairo, Kinshasa, Jartum, Lagos, Nairobi. Y luego hay un montón de pequeñas ciudades, puntos claves rurales, donde la gente intenta ganarse la vida. Uno de esos sitios está en el río Senegal, a unos 60 kilómetros de San Luis, si no calculo mal. Está en ese río que hace de frontera natural entre Mauritania y Senegal. Y en Senegal se vive también un poco toda esta problemática, ¿no? De lo general, del modelo económico, de las grandes corporaciones, de cómo se explota la gente, cómo la gente se tiene que ir a las ciudades porque ya no hay trabajo en el ámbito rural, con un añadido, y es que están llegando un montón de corporaciones internacionales, incluso españolas, a comprar territorio, a hacerse con los terrenos más fértiles, a cultivar y a exportar bajo nuestro modelo. Ni que decir tiene que con unas condiciones laborales y que revierte muy poco para las economías locales. Pues un ejemplo muy concreto de Senegal lo tienes tú. Cuéntanos cómo funciona todo este concepto internacional de modelo económico depredador en un sitio como el que tú conoces bien. Adelante.
Muchas gracias. Yo también quiero decir gracias a todos vosotros por estar aquí, a todos ustedes por estar aquí y a los organizadores de este Foro Social y de todo el Festival de Rototom. It's a pleasure. I will go me too to English. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you in this talk, and especially it is an honor to present this experience side by side with Samir Amin. We will go now from the macro level, Samir explained to us, down to some African field in Senegal. And I would like to show you how the expansion of global capitalism, explained by Samir Amin in his speech, reproduce itself in people's everyday lives. And the alternatives they can build to resist to such forms of accumulation through dispossession, depriving them from their means of production and transforming them in what Samir called useless people. To do that, I focus on one specific conflict I studied in Senegal, which proves, on the one hand, the vigorous attempts of dominant classes to strengthen at least 2 of the 5 monopolies described by Samir, namely that of natural resources and that of financial capital, namely so on land and food, and the renewed centrality of the agrarian question in Africa on the other. So what is the role of the peasantry in this scenario? Let's start by some facts and some figures to understand what's happening globally. So since 2007, increasing commodity prices have triggered financial, energy and food crises and exerted pressure on market supply chains. As a consequence, volatility of prices has increased, giving place to a renewed concern on food systems and energy transition models. International donor organizations and leaders of several countries have placed, once again, agriculture at the center of their political agenda, both for energy and food production. high-level policies on global food system governance focused on and linked food security, global food security, and investments in agriculture, and so in land. Unused land are leased, sold, or made available free of charge sometimes to national and international companies for large-scale projects, although actually providing livelihood for local people. This process has also triggered financial speculations, looking at agriculture and land acquisition as just another vehicle for profit maximization. Hence, during the last decade, millions of hectares of land have changed hands. A new wave of land deals by states, companies, investments, and pension funds has taken place to a great extent in the African continent. This trend has grabbed attention as it is taking place in an unprecedented magnitude, and because a growing number of political struggles have emerged due to different opposing groups. In sum, two main discourses arose. On the one hand, land deals are seen as a development opportunity by their proponents, while on the other, evidences that they take place usually with a very predatory character let a discourse about global land grabbing spreads among its opponents. This practice find legitimization, land acquisitions find legitimization in discourses very well rooted in history, showing some continuities with past trends of capital accumulation. Specifically, they lies on terms of like marginal, unused, empty, or potentially arable land, and label indigenous people as backward, irrational, and even ecologically dangerous. These discourses are very much connected with concepts such as that of terra nullius, which was formulated for the first time by the Papa Bulls to legitimate genocide and domination of European powers over overseas territories. In addition to this, realities on the ground are far trickier than just those portrayed by mainstream discourses. They see, for instance, a company, a state are found grabbing the land which a local community relies for its livelihood. And this often happens with the favor of a recipient state. Or so the logic goes. Nevertheless, during my fieldwork, I noticed that these discourses do not fit the reality I encountered. At least, it needs further investigation. These categories, these actors, are portrayed as homogeneous entities, neglecting the presence of groups, sub-groups, sub-industries, sub-companies, some funds behind the level of government that has also various positioning during a struggle. They change in order to preserve their power. So this paved the way also to stereotypization or simplistic interpretation of very complex realities affecting scientific analysis, of course, the elaboration of polities, and hiding the technical struggles or these people that are just labeled usually as poor people, but they really knows how to struggle, they really knows how to identify their means, to frame their struggle. And also hide the real structure of the capital that is not so straight. It needs to be investigated. So these narratives have to be challenged. Concepts such as the local community, company, government need to be questioned, explored to understand how to deal with divergence that divide people. Each stakeholder is composed of many units and levels, which in turn can be constituted of people, so have various social realities, economies, political relations, knowledge, views, and perception, and so are the other groups, of course. So, to see how this happened practically, let's look at a large-scale land acquisition by a private company, mainly Italian capital, to produce crops like sunflowers, corn, rice, groundnuts on 20,000 hectares of land in the peripheral area of the natural reserve of the Yael, which is located in the Senegal River Delta. The land was leased for free to the investor directly by the central government, excluding tout court the rural communities, which usually are entitled, which are the local level of government, usually are entitled to manage the land. Before to move on, I was leave the floor to a very short video I had the occasion to produce, and so to leave the floor to listen the voices of the people struggling today, to just understand better what's going on. Okay.
Leen sunu suuf bàyyi leen sunu suuf bul laal sama suuf maa bañ maa laal kenn du laal sama suuf jigéen taxaw na temm ngir aar suufam fegal sama doom duggum gaal.
Oh yeah.
Bangan terkena lah. Gamaya.
jàng mi no mbaɗa woni fof ɗum ndi min gandi a oɗo teere
projet bi dafa ñëw encore tàgguwul kenn daal di daaneel garab bàyyiwul yoon bàyyiwul kër nit bàyyiwul dara ñu wax sous préfet képp ku ñu wax dafa ànd ak projet amul ful demul dem nañu ministère yi dem nañu gàddaay dafa wax ni dafay yóbbu xayit yi dossier yi daf koy yóbbu conseil ba mu ko yóbbu ba mu waxee loolu ba léegi gisuñu ndimm nag gisuñu dara
remetaaki waɗetaaka hayɗa min koɗi ɗon min jiɗi ɗon jam ala fellede ala fellode ala soppode ala soppede ala roodo ala romdu min keɗi ɗon min jiwɗi worgo amen ko gese meɗen toon ñaade fof nana fer laam walla yoɓi million ngaji walla sokama sandar mum e ɗum woni vaccination jawdi gondi ndi ɗon te jawdi ndi so hay finguide haalaka mbeya walla mbaal walla nagge heɓe gandi ɗum ala saabu projet o heƴdeta hen seɓe tottama feccede ɗoɓe ndeme ɗoɓe gayni
jawdi ndi noon min min jahata makka hen min desat hen min mbatta kala komin cohli min mbayi ko tumra min mbayi ko asnode so minen alhamdulillah rabbil alamin min dañi dik a dow jawdi amen a teere o min ngala lewru min ganda lewru min gandi tan ko ɓe baale e nayyi
foofu rek lañu nekk lu ñu am foofu lañu koy amee lu ñu ñàkk foofu lañu koy ñàkk lu ko amoon bii bu ab doon sosoo ba léegi bii nga am kuy ñëw nekk wàññeeku de moom ñu ngi yokk alalam loolu day doy waaru di si nu dina bëggoon léegi daal
hay seki ene wonani hay seki minen noon min jittana woto won
dafa ñëwul pour demulin dafa ñëw pour gaañ ñu kejul foofu dañ ko indi pour kej foofu mënul kej foofu dañu seet ne mënul kej ndax li ñu yore ci jur ak ci dundin ak ci doom ak ñi war a béy ñi war a dund kejul ak projet
so amen siɓi doole noon siɓi amen doole kono baggal kam wawa amen kam
I am very glad to have the occasion to let you watch this video, because this was really a kind of promise when I started to work alongside those people. Actually, after I started to take some interviews with them, I demanded if they have a question for me, or one or more even. And they were always demanding, what can you actually do to stop this project? I told, okay, I have not the power to stop this project alone, but something I could be, and I would like to, and I will, it's to bring your story, to let the highest number of people to know your story, to share your struggle, and in case of a similar situation, to know that there are other people in the world struggling this way. So this case should be observed in the limelight of the agrarian transformation targeting the Delta since the last century. And I'll try now to briefly sketch it to understand who these people are. So the region was originally inhabited by several lineages of the Pearl group. Those people are Pearl. And at least since the 15th century, and they were engaged, they are in extensive pastoralism. Due to its environmental characteristic, the Delta was an ideal place for this practice. Was land use relies on a delicate equilibrium between several forms of mobility of people and cattle and access to resources. And it was also integrated with other land uses of other groups like farmers and fishermen. So, and all those land uses were regulated naturally by the flow of the river. And the project, yes. So the project of agrarian transformation is a colonial legacy, but it has been mostly implemented by the independent government since the 60s to pursue national rice self-sufficiency. It launched a new land and agrarian policy and rice production boost throughout the region. So the system of land management completely changed. The result was a growing reduction of grazing land, and access to water was reduced too. This marginalized pastoralist group, far from the irrigated land named Wallo, thus exacerbating competition over resources. So I'm still a geographer, so I will talk with you showing some maps. The movement, actually the Wallo land, as you can see, are all the lands between the river in the north and the line, the red line, which is a road that has been built. So that is the Wallo, and the land between the red line and the lake is the Jeri. So this is this distinction. People were moving freely, and pastoralists were forced were completely physically expelled from the Delta, from that part of the Delta, and they refugee in the other part. So this map shows the evolution of the agricultural schemes for rice farming in the Delta. They are concentrated, as I told, as you can see, in the northwest part of the region, because it's the most close to the water source. In the process in this process of change, even if they were labeled as backward or as traditional, the pastoralists have increasingly changed their lifestyle, and they adapted to the new socio-environmental settings. Some groups stay in the Wallo and have partially converted to agriculture, becoming agro-pastoralists for several reasons: diversification, preservation of land title, total loss of cattle during the drought, or just simple interest in the new activity. While others who decided to continue the extensive breeding and to do not engage in agriculture joined the other groups already living in the southern part, so the Ndiael area. And the black arrows, as I told you, shows the movement. So now, the Ndiael. The Ndiael Reserve is an administrative area administrated by the three rural communities, so Ngit, Ronk, Diama. It is organized in three parts: the protective, the buffer, and the peripheral zone. You can see the map with the red and green areas. The reserve was established in 1965 formally as a compensatory act for the downgrading of other two protected areas for rice cultivation, but informally also as a compensation for pastoralists that were legally granted their customary grazing right and other resource collection right and continued to settle inside the reserve border. This was tolerated and somehow legitimated by the government because the government was sending teachers for the new small schools, and but formally forbidden. Nowadays, the reserve constitutes a crucial resource for pastoralists, covering around 80% of the total grazing land of the region. As you can see in the map, the land acquisition is located exactly in the same area where pastoralists and their animals live. The grazing path, so the acquisition is really taking place where the villages are. And just to say, the territorial strategy is a new form of enclosure. We do not enclose the land to cultivate, we enclose the villages, as the suggestion of the territorial strategy of the company implied, to just leave to the villages some circles of 300 meters diameter for the formal villages and 500 meter diameter for the real formal villages. Just a detail. So, seeing this, we can really see how the Delta nowadays is a perfect example of the localization of this global policy on food security that focus on the so-called return to agriculture. The government of Senegal takes advantage of these policies to pursue its internal autonomy, so its national autonomy. Thus, the region became a perfect target for private land investments. And current large-scale projects are financed by international financial institutions and international donors, such as, for instance, the World Bank or the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or even private corporations promoting a development model which insists on the role of private capital to increase oil production on the so-called underexploited or potentially arable land. So I updated the previous map I showed to you, showing the rice farming scheme evolution by adding the new data of the recent land investments that, differently from before, now promote an irrigating industrial horticulture model, mainly export-oriented. So in the north, close to the water, a specific kind of soil rice production. Now we shift to exported horticulture. As you can see, these investments now are particularly targeting not anymore the wall, of course, so the northern part, but the southern one, so the Jeri rangeland, the so-called arrière-pays, which, as I show you in the other map, is the residual grazeland where pastoralists live. Consequently, they are being overwhelmed by this expansion of agribusiness, as they are blocked by the borders of represented by the farmland of the new agriculture. Hence, their positioning to this new investment shifted from previous passive acceptance to even violent resistance, flaring up several socio-environmental conflicts, like the conflict on the Yael. I reconstructed the diachronic evolution of the conflict in the Yael, lasting since now 5 years. Its effects, of course, on the territory, on the territorial transformation is bringing. My data has been collected through several techniques like participant observation, document analysis, individual and group interviews, GPS data, and audiovisual data, as you saw. So, this map, what is a map? A map represents a project of territory, which in turn represents a project of society. Hence, the flare-up point of conflict can be grasped by juxtaposing these maps produced by different actors present in the conflict. We can observe the divergence and convergence of their projects of territory and how this different representation of the same zone embed the different signification of land. So from land as a community, as a commodity, on the one hand, only a mere space of production, to land as places embedding real cultural identities. The first representation on the top left corner is a satellite image that is one of the technologies through which international institutions today survey space and inventories the global stock of potentially arable land. This map, showing a signification of land as a commodity, just investigate a specific interpretation of a physical dimension of land. There is no other sign of anything, you can see just land and water. The second, this representation, the first one, converge with the second one produced by the investors to display the acquired land and promote it on the website. Similarly to the first one, this also is nothing more than a satellite image, but we can notice that the border of the investments are represented here. So this is my land. Even also in this case, it just shows a physical dimension of land, and there is again no mention of any interaction of people living there with the environment and people land uses. The area is simplified as a territory of nothing more than a desert, as a company representative declared. The third map, down on the in the low left corner, although so much different from the other, also present a similarity with them. It was created by a governmental agency to propose the delocalization of the land acquisition in the Ndiael area. This map only reports the administrative borders of the administrative division of the reserve without any information more about local land uses, except from some tracts. Moreover, it shows only 6 of the many villages present there. I have personally mapped and visited around 40. Due to old GPS data or intentionally, this simplification has legitimated the perception of the Ndiael as an empty area, with an abundant availability of land, impacting, of course, on the decision-making process of the government. So the situation looks completely different in the last map, the fourth one. This one is the result of a participatory mapping exercise developed to improve local governance on land, and became an institutional practice in each rural community of the region. The map shows the integrated local land uses. You can see in the area of the Ndiael, the red one are just area that should be dedicated to pastoralism, so grazing land. The purple area have a priority to pastoralism, and only the external one, just those close to the lake, the green one, are the area that should be dedicated to agriculture. This map also represents the many villages I also mapped, so it clearly shows that the villages are missing in the previous one. I don't know if you can clearly see, but there are gray points on the map. So clearly this map, the last one, is in contrast with others, thus showing the core element of this conflict. Disputed projects of territories and the element of space. Who owns what? Who has access and control to land? In spite of inclusion in the territorial planning, these groups seem to have been ignored since the central government has imposed the lease of all the land to a unique investor for agricultural use, which in the same way has ignored local land uses, imposing its exclusive monopoly over the land. So, no, excuse me, I continue with it. Due to time restraint, I will not explore in detail the steps of the conflict. There are some open access policy report I had the occasion to write. They are available online. And I will just say here that up to date, the conflict is the result of specific strategies deployed by each actors in 3 main phases, which we can sum up in this way. Our first one, resistance. The strong lack of initially, the strong lack of information and the use of military force was used were used to secure the power in the area. Opponents reacted at the beginning, of course, in violent ways first, and then they have been able and they decided to organize in a grassroots movement seeking support of international organizations to scale up the conflict. The engagement of international actors, like me, for instance, because I should be considered as well as, allowed circulation of information, raised awareness of international audience, and reshaped the power equilibrium. This let the conflict move of a different phase that I called opposition. The conflict moved from a just physical level to an informative one. The struggle was fought mainly by circulation of information, discourses conveyed by word to mouth, social media, press, and so on. At the local level, so it was an opposition of different discourses and different information. At the local level, in order to undermine the cohesion of people and the reliability of the movement, and to gain consensus, the members of the investor companies did a leverage on socio-economic differences of family groups, deploying strategies of divide et impera, very old strategies, but still working, unless we have so many social differences. For instance, by means of the implementation of small development projects, job promises, gifts like a trip to La Mecca, a flight, and thus their division of people succeeded. They also, on the other hand, at a national level, they aligned to food sovereignty discourses of the government, stressing the importance of these projects for Senegal nation to reach the food self-sufficiency. The third phase of the conflict is to proposal. As this phase indeed has been characterized and is being characterized by identification of new alternative. After strong efforts, the grassroots movements has been able to re-establish a greater cohesion of its social basis, and facilitated mostly by the scarce results of the farming activities of the company and increasingly emerging real speculative aims of the investors. At this stage, the movement understood they cannot limit to contrast the rhetoric of the company. They realized that in order to reach their autonomy and to reshape the equilibrium of power, they not only need to control good circulation of information, but also to secure control over the means of production, the land. They started to show their alternative to the unproductive farming large-scale projects, and hence they started to occupy physically the land and are currently also figuring out how to improve their pastoralism, how to evolve their pastoralism, visiting other pastoralist groups in Europe and even in Asia, and try to collectively purchase a milk collection unit. So, I hope this brief trip in the reserve helped you to figure out how people currently are trying to face capitalist accumulation through dispossession, and how there means what this means in the everyday politics, and how important it is to look for alternatives that could be even that explain and that should at least be that Samir explained before, that is about the importance to give a common sense to such global struggles. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bueno, enseguida va a haber turno para algunas preguntas, pero voy a aprovechar que los tengo cerca para empezar yo con las preguntas. Has hablado del capitalismo, de la oligarquía del capitalismo que que sigue controlando buena parte de la economía y sometiendo a, decías, al 60-70% de los europeos, al 90% de los africanos, de los asiáticos. Pero vamos a intentar poner algún ejemplo de supuesto crecimiento que no lo está, ¿no? Si uno mira los datos del Banco Mundial, ve que Sudáfrica, Ghana, Gabón o Guinea Ecuatorial tienen unos índices de crecimiento económico muy importantes. De hecho, si incluso miras el PIB por habitante, parecería que algunos de esos países tienen cierto desarrollo positivo. Pero yo no sé, Samir, si al final los supuestos buenos ejemplos de África, que supuestamente crecen, al final no son víctimas también del mismo sistema capitalista que está sometiendo a los trabajadores pobres o empobrecidos en el norte. ¿Cómo lo ves?
Thank you. That is a very interesting and relevant question. Now, if we look at facts, since the early 90s, say, that is already 25 years and more, you have, on the one hand, very low rates of growth in United States, Europe and Japan. As I said, half of what they had been before. And they never got back since, which means that this is not a ordinary crisis, recession. It's a permanent recession, which means a systemic crisis. But simultaneously, the rates of growth in the rest of the world are higher than they had been before. Much higher in the case of China, much higher in the case of India, Brazil, but also South Africa and other places like Ghana, for instance, recently. Now, out of that reality, some people conclude that capitalism is okay, it's in good health. But what is happening is the transfer of central gravity of capitalism from the old Atlantic West, Europe and North America, to the so-called Pacific South, basically Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, but also Latin America and potentially Africa. That is, in my opinion, a very wrong analysis of that reality. That is, the rates of growth per se are meaningless or are of a very limited meaning. The rates of growth, what is more important or as important as the rates of growth is the rates of growth within what type of international division of labor and what type of globalization. Now, the high rates of growth, particularly for the African countries and particularly for those selected by our friend, South Africa and Ghana, are related exclusively to the plunder of natural resources. The plunder of natural resources. You know, when you have suddenly in a country oil or mining or agribusiness on a large scale, you have an extra production which is, for a good part, almost all of it, exported. And that gives not only a high rate of growth, but it gives also a shaping of the society which benefits to an increasing so-called middle class. That middle class, which 30 years ago represented only for most countries, for all countries south of the Sahara and north of Limpopo, that is except South Africa, and Rhodesia of that time, was very small, 1-5%, depending on the way you define it, is coming now close to 20%. That is what is considered by the World Bank as the positive result of development and of high growth. That is a disaster, because the wealth of those growing middle class is part of the extra wealth, most of it being pumped through, as I said, subcontracting from the areas and the industries which are plundered. Now, and therefore, that is at the expense of the 80% which get impoverished for a good number of them, including those peasants which are excluded, or at best stagnant, and cannot be different. Therefore, we should be very careful about measuring the development. Development is just as sovereignty. It's very ambiguous. Development to the benefit of whom? And in a logic which can benefit to whom? Now, if, as the World Bank said, but this is a rhetoric, there are longer run effects to the benefit of more and more. That's not true. That's not true. I mean, what Marx called the law of pauperization associated to capital accumulation, and which most of the Europeans, including former communists, believe to have been wrong, because if you look at the European society, it's wrong. But if you look at the global capitalist society, and not of the imperialist centers isolated from the rest of the world, you find that process of pauperization much more severe than what Marx even imagined. Now, in 1800, at the beginning of the English Industrial Revolution, the ratio, as calculated by Paul Béroche, and I think he's a very good observer of history, was 1 to 1.13. It's very precise. Anyway, let's say 1 to 1 point something. And not necessarily to the benefit of Europe. China had, until 1840, a GDP per capita, if we calculate it in that way, higher than Europe. Higher. And even until 1820, higher than Britain, than the United Kingdom. That was, now the rate is 1 to 30, 1 to 60, according to how you calculate it. That is a gigantic pauperization, far more severe than what Marx imagined. And that process of high rates of growth is part of a process of global pauperization, in which a growing minority, but which will remain a minority, and relatively small minority, 20%, at the cost of the vast majority. But politically, it's a disaster, because these middle classes of 20% are reactionaries and are politically very important. You can see it in Brazil, in Venezuela. The counter-revolution is manipulated, is managed by those middle classes. You can see it in Europe. The basis for the pro-liberal, or liberal socialists and liberals of the traditional parliamentary right are those middle classes. I repeat, in the case of the French election, Macron got, in fact, supporting him 16%. And he got a parliament which looks like the Cairo parliament now, as ridiculous as it, which is the normal nucleus of ordinary conservative people, including with a reactionary vision, which accept inequality, accept, etc., etc. So we ought to be very careful about this concept of so-called development and more reduced to rates of growth. In the case of South Africa, unfortunately, nothing has changed in South Africa. Yes, a big change, a political one, the fact that the majority of people, the blacks, have conquered the right to be citizens, political citizens, not only for elections, but recognized as human beings, equal to the others, is a gigantic change. But it was at the cost of accepting that the economic system would have no change. 83% of the land of South Africa continues to be the property of a small number, in thousands, of white former settlers. The industries are totally, the industries, the trade, the banking system, the insurance system, all that continues to be 100% controlled by the Anglo-American, which is one of the major capitalist financial organization. Now, that has led to what? To Marikana. That is to the political system now moving to be, while it was ambiguous in the first decade, to be the executive, political and military and police system in the service of this monopoly, and assassinated, killing minors in a strike, nothing less than that. So this is not an emerging country. It has been associated with the BRICS in order to make a show, and because of political reasons of South Africa. ANC pretending to be a liberation movement. It was, but it is no more.
Bueno, dice tantas cosas que podríamos entrar a repreguntar, ¿no? Un montón. Ahora voy a dar paso al público, pero el caso de Sudáfrica es muy interesante, ¿eh? Y creo que se está alarmando de nuevo un conflicto social muy importante, ¿no? Desgraciadamente. Pero en el caso de lo concreto otra vez, de este pueblo del delta del río Senegal, ¿no? Se ha nombrado el proceso de desplazamiento forzoso de la población. Si le quitas las tierras a los agricultores, si la gente no puede cultivar, no puede tener trabajo, etcétera, etcétera, muchos jóvenes se tienen que ir a buscar la vida a las ciudades. Y se me ocurre, igual que esta zona del río Senegal, se me ocurre el Gorgol, que está al otro lado del río, en la zona de Mauritania, una zona de hambre crónica. Se me ocurre Kolda, en el sur de Senegal, también una zona agrícola donde la gente se tiene que ir por el problema relacionado también con la mala gestión de la agricultura. Al final, volvemos siempre a hablar de agricultura. Son 900 millones de habitantes en el continente africano, hay un proceso de urbanización creciente de las poblaciones, pero la mayoría de los habitantes de África siguen dependiendo de la agricultura. Con este modelo que están introduciendo las corporaciones internacionales, como las italianas o las españolas, no vamos a solucionar nada, ¿no?
Bueno, sí. It's actually proven that large-scale capitalistic model of production, intensive farming, are not the most productive. I want just to make a point and distinguish between what is called small-scale farming and family or agroecologic or peasant farming, because usually these two words are used in the same way. But small-scale farming can be capitalistic and can be intensive, and so can be unsustainable. On the other hand, we have the peasant farming techniques like agroecology, techniques like the campesino to campesino, campesino a campesino. We have the family farming technique that are still feeding the world. And they have the bigger capacity of production. I would also like to state another point, because usually this dynamic of large-scale plantations, intensive productions are legitimated also by demographic numbers. In 2015, our population will be doubled, but so we need more intensive technique. We need to raise production, growth. These concepts are not proven at all, because it is not a problem of a matter of production, it's a matter of distribution. How much food every day go to the garbage here in Europe, in the US, in the world. This model of production, our diet, is not sustainable at all. A lot of food is used, a lot of land is used to feed animals raised in intensive livestock farming system. These systems are unsustainable. Is the same as capitalism, the intensive productive model that we are currently using are unsustainable. So this is what really we should target, in my opinion. Thank you.
Samir,
I will be very short. A compliment to what has been said. I spent 2 months in China with a Chinese team of the Academy, Wen Tiejun and others, trying to calculate the results of a capitalist way for agriculture. Half of the job was for China, and half of the job was extrapolating it or implementing it for not the whole South, but a big part of it, all Asia and all Africa, not Latin America. We reached the following conclusions, which have been published in Chinese and in Arabic, French, English, and Spanish for Latin America. 50 million modern agriculturalists, I would not say peasants, call it farmers. The English language distinguishes the farmer from the peasant. 50 millions. With their family, 200 or 300 million people. Could, with modern techniques, the one which are used in Europe and North America, produce the same quantity of food that are produced presently by 4 billions. Provided you expropriate most of the 4 billions minus 300 millions, that is 3 billions and 700 millions. They give them the best land, give them credit and equipment, etc. So, and this is presented as would be a major achievement of civilization. It considers that almost 4 billion people are useless. Useless, simply as that. And therefore, if you don't kill them, if you have to give them a minimal for surviving, that reduces the rentability of the procedure. I mean the financial rentability and social rentability, profitability for those who benefit from it, the 50 billions, is overcompensated by the adjustment, by the subsidies that you should give for the survival of the others in shanty towns or attempting to come to Europe through the Mediterranean or the Atlantic Ocean, as you see. That is the measurement. It has been measured, but it is very little known, unfortunately, I would say, within the European left, including the Marxist and communist tradition.
Bueno, nos vamos quedando sin tiempo, pero vamos a abrir un turno de preguntas. Ya me habían pedido la mano por aquí adelante. Si quieren, recopilamos una ronda primero y vamos contestando. Empezamos por aquí, por la izquierda, que habían pedido primero la mano.
Thank you. Like Samir Amin yesterday, I have 6 points I'd like to make today. The first of all, I mean, I think it's really important that to have somebody of the stature of Samir Amin here at Rotterdam, I think is an extraordinary thing. And I think due congratulations to the organizers of Rotterdam for doing so. I think we can't go away without saying that. I think has been an outstanding session this afternoon. I want to take up the idea that both have put forward, and that is that in effect we are talking about vast sections of the world's population being dehumanized, being completely thrown out on the heap of history, with no future, and just considered as the waste of humanity. In other words, what we talked about last night over dinner, these are post-apocalyptic populations. These are people who have experienced what the rest of us are blind to, and that is what our future will look like. And in that situation, it seems to me that I don't think anyone would argue that we do not need some kind of international actions taking place. But the point I want to make here, Samir, is what has happened to your audacity? Because this is the time to be audacious. This is the time not just to say, of course, we need health services. Of course, we need education. Of course, we need all these other social infrastructures. But it is a time for saying that given, as that video quite easily demonstrated, that our governments are being considered as illegitimate, as being not having not being considered as serving the needs of those who have elected them, then I think we have to think about, and I'm very impressed by the Senegal data there, about the creation of alternatives, of looking at how those alternatives are. But if we are going to build, I think if we're going to build an international, then I think what we need to do, and I'd be interested in your reaction to this, Samir and David, and that is to say, should we not be looking at, rather than saying we will try and bring an international together around demands on health, education, and so on, instead look at where people are engaged in direct struggles and see how do we connect one struggle with the other? How do we connect those who are engaged in opposing the attempts of the ruling class to make us continue to be post-apocalyptic populations? rather saying let's build on those connections, build on those who are already engaged in struggle, because I think that's where the solidarity will begin to create the conditions upon which an international can be built. Thank you. I can't remember the sixth point, but anyway, that'll do.
¿Algo que decir sobre esta reflexión? ¿Algo que decir sobre esta reflexión? ¿Sí? Ok.
Muchísimas gracias, Samir, David, por la presentación y por la intervención del compañero que la retomo por una inquietud de cómo unificar lo global y lo local y teniendo en cuenta que el sistema económico en el que nos encontramos también afecta a la estructura social, ¿no? Y eso afecta al tema identitario y en ese sentido, cómo ese movimiento social necesario para cambiar la estructura que comentaba Samir podría trabajar en un terreno local como en Senegal, ¿no? Cuando la gente migra porque se ve forzada a abandonar la tierra. Entonces, ¿cómo podríamos unificar ese movimiento social y llevarlo al campo local? ¿Cuáles serían los pasos a seguir de ese movimiento social? ¿Cuáles serían los mecanismos para difundir este mensaje, ¿no? Porque mi preocupación es que justamente el sistema económico, como decía antes, desestructura y al final nos olvidamos del prójimo. Entonces, bueno, es una inquietud que os traslado y a ver si me podéis ayudar. Gracias.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Y la respondemos, vamos respondiendo a esta por si se animan. Adelante. ¿Quién quiere? ¿Samir?
Thank you. Yes, the reference to audacity in both cases is fundamental in my analysis, because what has been sadly characteristic of the last 30 or 40 years is the lack of audacity of the potential radical left in all the world, north and south, west and east. That is those who inherited the Marxist and communist tradition of the Third International, particularly, and of their allies, semi-allies in the South. But this left does exist, very tiny currently, but it is present almost, well, not necessarily everywhere in each country of the planet, but in all the continents. And it is present even in Africa. We had in December a meeting in Dakar, which was discussing the other report for Africa, that is other than the conventional World Bank type of report on rates of growth and so on, by another pattern type of analysis. And this exercise was well done by quite a number of people, and not only academics, but also leaders of political and social movements, which means that it exists, but lack of audacity. I think that, and you find the same have happened particularly in Europe in a catastrophic way. In Italy, the most catastrophic, I think, in history, in France, in Spain, which have a historical tradition of a radical left. It's not something new. And in many other places. It has happened in the former Soviet Union, particularly in Russia. I attended meetings of the now 5 communist parties of Russia have inherited, in spite of their differences and strong ones, that tradition. All of them lack of audacity. I think that, I take the case of Egypt, Sabahi in the presidential elections got 5 million votes. That is as much as what's his name, Muslim, and now Sisi got, but before Sisi, what's his name? Help me. The former Muslim brother of Egypt, Morsi. The same figure. It is the US embassy who decided that Morsi was elected. It's not the Egyptian electoral committee, which found that perhaps Sabahi has as much voice, perhaps even more. Anyway, I attended the meeting which launched the campaign of Sabahi. And I said, yes, we are the minority, but we are the minority which can drag the majority. Because we have a program, we have an analysis of the problems, and the people understand it. The others, they have voices, but with no problem, with no program. Either market will solve the problems, which is wrong, or God will solve the problems. I don't know if it is right or wrong, but nothing more. So being the minority today, I don't see why in Europe, and I discussed that in Spain, in Madrid a month ago, with people of Podemos, Izquierda Unida, le Comisiones Obreras, Partido Comunista, lack of audacity. I think you could be audacious in Spain and reestablish the republic, by the way, in the way of the
David.
Sí. Bueno, I was impressed by the two questions because I think they are logically interconnected. In a way, we have 2 points, how to interconnect struggles, realities in space and time, at different level, in different places. So, I really do not have an answer to this question yet, but I think that something important is still happening. So, the spreading of information. Unless we are able to convey information, to spread information, and to critically analyze information, we will be able to at least have one of the components that create power, information and resources. So maybe to spread information, to work on use a symmetric field could be maybe something of help. Then, I don't know, I have some maybe small point related to some principle that help me to think. That one of sustainability, so think over every time we plan, we decide to make a choice, to think over time. So what will happen if I enact this choice in the future? So choice in a way that could be locally oriented, but being aware that every place is connected with other places, and each place has some distinctiveness, but its interrelation with other places has an impact in every choice that we decide to orient locally. And then the principle of equity, so try at least to consider in every choice all actors in places, because if we create imbalance, we will create people that will become useless after a while after in the history. So maybe I really did not answer to your questions, but I hope this small food for talks could be helpful in this. Thank you.
Y tenemos la última pregunta porque ya nos quedamos sin tiempo, así que adelante.
Bueno, primero agradecer la ponencia que me ha parecido súper importante. Dice que hable muy alto. Que me han parecido súper importantes las dos ponencias, los puntos de vista. Vivo cerca de donde se ha hecho el proyecto Senuil, vivo cerca. Y de hecho en mi segundo libro hay un caso concreto de una persona que tenía su granja y lo tuvo que vender, y con lo que vendió emigró y ahora está en Granada. Y pues es un caso concreto del caso que David ha tratado, que me ha parecido súper importante. Ojalá que la cooperación sirviese para eso, sirviese para desmantelar todas esas multinacionales que están saqueando los recursos africanos. La pregunta que tengo sería para Samir. Después de escuchar toda su intervención, me he quedado con una duda, me he quedado con una pregunta, porque antes de venir aquí a leer sobre él, saber que es economista, un intelectual con mucha influencia y mucho conocimiento y tal, y un economista también, sabiendo la estrategia económica que Occidente utiliza para poder también dominar económicamente el continente africano, me surge la duda de un economista como tú, que ha expuesto todo lo que ha puesto. ¿Cómo surge la idea de crear un foro social y llamarle un foro social del tercer mundo? Sabiendo que el término tercer mundo es un término que Occidente utilizó para victimizar África, para poder venderle su modelo de desarrollo. Entonces, eso es mi pregunta. ¿Cómo surge este foro social, llamarlo con ese nombre en concreto?
Bueno, te cuento, Mamadou.
In one sentence only, I think we need to go beyond social forums, whether African or global or in a country, Senegal or elsewhere. Social forums are places where you discuss, and this is important, and we should have, and more and open discussions, accepting the various points of view and critique and responding to the critiques. Yes, but it's not enough. What we need is organization, which help the various struggles to combine, to come together in a strategy which has targets of change, bringing changes in the system of powers.
Bueno, desgraciadamente nos quedamos sin tiempo. Han sido 2 horas de debate, de intervención muy interesante. Solo aclararles que el último en preguntar es Mamadou Dia, que es de Senegal, que ha escrito un par de libros, que llegó a España en Cayuco, y lo conozco de esa época, y que es una persona de las que merece la pena leer y escuchar, porque tiene una experiencia muy rica sobre todo lo que pasa en su país y sobre su experiencia también en Europa y en España. Ha sido un placer escuchar a Samir, todo un intelectual. Yo creo que nos llevamos hoy un regalo de escuchar algunas de las reflexiones que parecen a veces dormidas y que están por ahí, que nos olvidamos un poco de la importancia de reflexionar sobre el modelo económico que tenemos. Gracias a David también. Y ojalá ideas como estas sirvan para que dentro de un tiempo vivamos en un mundo un poquito más justo, por lo menos más igual, ¿no? Así que muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos y todas. Muchas gracias a los interpretadores. Muchas gracias. Y hasta luego.
Muchísimas gracias Samir, Nicolás, Davide. Muchísimas gracias a todos por vuestra asistencia. Os esperamos el año que viene en el Foro Social.